Boldwood presents Sisters Behaving Badly, written by Maddie Please and read by Penelope Freeman. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. I thought I was ridiculously early that morning, but my elder sister was already there. Of course she was. Jenny had probably never been late for anything in her life, and to be honest, I'd hardly ever been early. I saw her before she clocked me. She was walking towards a row of seats in front of the plate glass windows overlooking the sea. Still apprehensive about this meeting, I was semi-lurking behind the queue for the cafe. At first glance, it looked as though she hadn't changed a bit since we last met. Still the same smooth, bobbed, salt and pepper hair, the trim, precise figure, the same measured expression. Even the way she pulled her bag behind her was familiar, and at that moment slightly annoying. How could someone who was just walking and pulling a small suitcase irritate me? Perhaps after everything that had happened, all the time that had passed, my early start and several disturbed nights, thanks to my constantly partying neighbours in the flat above mine, I was just on edge. I paused, hoping things between us would be better now after all these years apart. The last time we'd met hadn't gone well at all. A tepid Carvery lunch followed by a blistering row, and then some door-slamming, Jenny, and flouncing, me. I glanced over to where Jenny was now sitting, looking out of the window at the boats and the seagulls, and for a moment was sad that she wasn't bothering to look for me. Why wasn't she looking for me? Perhaps she wasn't anticipating our trip with much pleasure either. What a strange frame of mind for us to be in, considering we were about to go off on a sort of holiday and would be living together for the first time in, how long was it? 40 years? Perhaps 38. Where had the time gone? Well, I was younger than Jenny, but that didn't mean I couldn't be more mature, and I was suddenly desperate to start the healing process, the explanations, the apologies. Perhaps it was up to me to break the ice. I took a deep breath, put a smile on my face, and went over to join her. She was sitting very straight in her seat, her ankles neatly crossed, wearing a flowery dress and one of her many ghastly hand-knitted cardigans. Nothing had changed there, then. "Hi, Jenny," I said, my throat giving an annoying croak that made it sound as though I was about to burst into tears. Actually, I did feel as if I might start crying. This was a moment I had thought about for a very long time. She looked up. "Hello, Kitty." That used to make us both laugh not so long ago. It had started every letter, every email. I can't think of the number of makeup bags, backpacks and T-shirts with that slogan Jenny had given me as presents in the past. But it had been nearly 6 years since we'd met in person. A lot of water had gone under a lot of bridges. Still, you would think she might show a bit more reaction to the fact that we were meeting up at last. I felt very emotional, if I was honest. I'd missed her so much. I hoped that she had missed me. She half rose from her seat, and we shared an awkward, rather mechanical hug. I sat down on the other side of the table that still bore the smears of when it had last been carelessly wiped, crumbs in the corners. I wasn't house-proud, but I bet I could have done a better job than that. The seat was slippery with polish, and I thought about sliding down under the table to make my sister laugh. But at my age I might not have been able to haul myself back up again without a complete loss of dignity. So I didn't. Gone were the days when I could get up without sound effects. Jenny hadn't appreciated my sense of humour in recent years anyway. Perhaps that had been part of the problem. I sometimes think I have a foot-in-mouth disease. "How are you? Good drive down to Plymouth?" I said. Now that the first awkwardness was over, I was excited, pleased to see her, hopeful that we could mend bridges. She, on the other hand, sounded quite composed. "Fine, thanks. Only about 45 minutes from home. You? I nodded. Yes, so easy. Train straight through from Bristol to Plymouth, and then I got a taxi from the station. Great, Jenny said. She pushed her glasses up her nose and looked out of the window again. Oh, God. It looked like this was going to be hard work, but I'd never been one to give up easily. She did look older, which I suppose was to be expected. Her hair was greyer now, same as mine. Her face was a bit more lined. To a casual observer, we would have looked exactly what we were, a pair of middle-aged, middle-sized sisters going off to France on the ferry together. Her blue eyes, behind the sensible metal-rimmed spectacles, were expressionless. I turned to see what she was looking at. Drake's Island, perhaps. Some dull concrete buildings on the dockside. A man in a high-vis jacket driving a forklift truck. None of it looked that interesting. It didn't feel at all comfortable. The atmosphere was possibly worse than I'd expected. The ice needed a lot more breaking, possibly with a pickaxe or some explosives. How's life? Okay, I said. Fine, thanks. You? Jenny replied, flicking me a glance. Yes, super, great, terrific, I gushed. There wasn't really anyone to mention that she would know. Chums from my latest 0-hour contract job at the estate agency, the noisy couple living in the flat above mine who seemed to have taken up midnight clog dancing, my friends from the book club who even now were ploughing gamely through some leaden book about death and disease in Guatemala. Jenny sighed and flicked on her mobile. Oh, well, that's good. No more of your usual dramas, then? I clenched my teeth and didn't reply to this barb, but watched while she sent a text message, and wondered if I could think of someone to text too. I suppose I could have sent another cheery message to Diana or Scarlett at work, to see how they were coping without me, although the property market was a bit stagnant, and they hadn't seemed to worry that I was taking so much time off. Or I could have sent a text to the neighbours, friends from the book group, but I'd already been in touch with all of them. I didn't think they needed a blow-by-blow account of my day. Maybe to my ex-husband Steve, but his new child bride was expecting any day now. I couldn't think of anything that would have sounded sarcastic, and why would I contact him anyway? Perhaps at that moment he was gowned up in the delivery room, patting Leanne's forehead with a damp cloth and feeding her ice cubes. Bastard. Suddenly I was consumed with frustration, and, as had so often happened in the past, I wanted to do something outrageous. I wanted to throw my arms around Jenny and cry, tell her how much I'd missed her, suggest we all draw a line, forget what had happened between us, remember the good bits, apologise to each other, make an effort, laugh again, reminisce about all the funny times we'd shared, the excuses we had made for each other with our parents, our teachers, the scrapes we'd got into and out of together. But I did none of those things. I just sat there, fidgeted with my bag, and wondered what we could talk about. I decided on an easy topic, sure ground, the one she liked best. How's Paul? And how is Jason? I mean Ace. Years ago I'd taken her son Jason to see Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, as a birthday treat, and he'd been obsessed with the character, insisting on being called Ace from that day onwards, and the nickname had stuck. It suited him too. He was bright, cheerful and popular wherever he went. I liked him enormously. He was nothing like his father. She gave a little smile, and her face brightened. Fine, thanks. Paul's busy with work. Accountants are always overwhelmed at this time of year. It's the end of the tax year, and all his clients are desperate for his attention. We haven't seen Ace for a bit, although we text each other, of course. He spent Christmas in Scotland with some friends again, working at a homeless shelter before he went back to Nantes. Did you know he lives there now? What a great thing to do! And Nantes, yes, of course I remember. How exciting, I said eagerly. He's teaching at the university," Jenny added proudly. "French and English history, his two passions." I widened my eyes. "That's amazing. He's only 13. Old joke. For a long time it seemed that Ace was the perennially overprotected child of two helicopter parents. Chinooks, probably, or at least Sea Kings. I, for one, was secretly astonished when he actually left home. She gave a polite smile, scrolled through her photos and passed her phone across the table to show me one of Ace, mid-laugh, standing with a load of his friends, one arm around a woman with green hair. By the look of things, he was in a pub and a lot more than half cut. There were Christmas lights behind him twinkling among the whiskey bottles. Good to see he was enjoying life. He'd also grown a really unattractive beard, which was a shame as he was a nice-looking chap. I couldn't understand this new passion for face fungus, but then I was probably out of the loop. I'd only just got to grips with designer stubble. My husbands might have turned out to be losers, but at least they all knew how to shave. "How marvellous," I said enthusiastically. "He looks happy. And you'll both be in France for a bit. And he's doing so well, I bet. He always was so clever." As I hadn't met up with her son for a long time either, this was a stab in the dark. I had no idea if he was doing well at all. Still, Ace had been to university, he had a teaching qualification and a PhD in some obscure facet of French history, and he could speak 3 languages the last time I'd asked. I expected he was now fluent in 5 more, knowing him. "He is. We are very proud of him," Jenny said with a little smile. "So, has he got a significant other then?" The smile faded and the shutters came down. "Not that we know of. He's terrifically busy, and he's never been a letter writer. Young people aren't these days, are they?" Well, there were still emails and phones, surely. WhatsApp and FaceTime. And Ace was 30-something, not a kid whose phone had run out of credit. Ace, like me, had never got on particularly well with his father. Perhaps things had changed. Perhaps they hadn't. I didn't press the point. I wasn't going to mention Paul again. I wish I'd managed to travel more. I love planes and airports. I've got an app on my phone that tells me what the planes are and where they're going. I love imagining being on one of them, sitting back in my seat with a glass of something. And ferries are marvellous too, aren't they? I said after a while, nodding at the views spread out in front of us. Far out on the horizon, it looked as though it was raining. "Some of them are. I doubt this one will be," Jenny replied rather dismissively. "It's not exactly Cunard, is it?" There was another awkward silence. "Have you had breakfast? Do you fancy a coffee?" I was halfway out of my seat before I'd finished talking. "I'll go if you do." "I'm fine, thanks. I don't drink much coffee these days, only decaf, and Paul made me a packed lunch for the journey. But you go. I'll watch your bag." Was she keen to get me to go already? I hope not. How long was it going to take before we could both relax with each other, perhaps forgive each other? I looked around. There was a line of people, parents mostly, with tired children hanging on their arms, requesting crisps and luminous drinks. "It's okay, I'll wait," I said, sitting back down again. "There's still a bit of a queue." We sat in silence for a few minutes, until I couldn't bear it any more. "So, this is exciting, isn't it? A trip to France to see our inheritance?" "Yes, very. I was told Aunt Sheila's solicitors had sorted out all the necessary taxes and that sort of thing. I hope it's true." Jenny sounded as excited as though I'd suggested a day out at the dentist's. I persevered, hoping to get the conversation flowing. "I wonder what the house is like now. When I was there last, Aunt Sheila was full of ideas of things she might do. She wrote telling me she was having new windows fitted and the electrics done. You and Paul went there several times, didn't you? We almost joined you once when I was living in Worcester. With Oliver? Now, which husband was he? Oh, I remember, the bigamist, Jenny said, arching one eyebrow. What a good memory you have, I said frostily. I hadn't known he was a bigamist. I think I deserved sympathy under the circumstances, not scorn. It hadn't exactly been a picnic for me. That visit of ours was ages ago. The last time Paul and I went was when we just popped in on our way to Aquitaine. I honestly don't think much had changed since you went. Of course we didn't stay with Aunt Sheila. It was still a bit rustic. Paul gets very edgy if there isn't air conditioning or a buffet breakfast. The house still needed a lot doing to it, as I remember, so don't get your hopes up. But I bet it's great now, I said rather too enthusiastically. Aunt Sheila had a lot of plans, didn't she? Yes, she did. But she was like her brother, like Dad, never one to do things in a rush. It had a great view of the countryside and the sea in the distance, and she had planted lots of trees, Jenny said. I wish we could have gone to the funeral, I said, but the lawyer said she didn't want any fuss. It seems a shame. Jenny pushed her specs up her nose again. I absolutely agree. It felt rather sad not to go, but on the other hand I was quite relieved. Paul is very odd about funerals. A funeral in France, well, it would have been awful. He made enough of a fuss about his uncle in Yeovil, and that was only 50 minutes away. Well, I would have gone if I'd known, I said. I wrote to her when she went into hospital, and even when she was really ill she had lots of plans and ideas. She was such a positive person, so full of life, wasn't she? Sometimes I still can't believe she's gone. Jenny glanced at her watch. Look at the time. We should be leaving soon. She always was very good at changing the subject. I resisted the impulse to shake my sister out of her reserve. I could remember the time when we had got on so well. If I looked back, I was remembering years ago, so perhaps my memory was a bit rose-tinted. I remembered us laughing, squabbling, pinching each other's makeup, cheering each other up in bad times, celebrating the good. Late nights in our shared bedroom, laughing until we were nearly sick. Had she forgotten all that? I hadn't. There had been boyfriends and our parents to deal with, school, exams to commiserate over. We had always been so close, allies, protective of each other. How had it come to this? If only it was possible to go back and do things differently. But of course it wasn't. Things had been said that could never be unsaid or forgotten. It was no good pretending otherwise. But there had to be something I could do to find a way for us to be friends again. The engines far below us shuddered as the ferry shimmied away from the quayside, left Plymouth, and headed out into Plymouth Sound. It was a mild spring morning, the sky blue above us, and the sea reassuringly smooth. Jenny cleared her throat, took out her knitting, and opened a book. Judging by the cover, it was something about miserable people caught up in a war. We used to swap books. We had a bookcase in our bedroom filled with dog-eared paperbacks. I didn't much like the look of that one. What happened to her passion for Jilly Cooper and Georgette Heyer? And why was she knitting a cardigan in such a dreary colour, a sort of sludge green crossed with mud? In other words, dull. Still knitting, then? I said. Jenny gave a polite smile. It's for Paul. Yes, he would look quite the cool dude in that. Across the aisle from us was a young woman who was taking surreptitious sips from a water bottle. Why were the younger generation so terrified of going anywhere without a water bottle clutched in one hand? Was it a sport thing? Was the girl pretending she was a marathon runner? Was she on her way to a Zumba class in Roscoff? Did she think the tap water was poisonous? Young people must spend their lives nipping to the loo. I wouldn't get anything done if I was drinking water all day. It would be asking for trouble. And she had no coat and was wearing 2 different strappy tops at once, both of which were too small. I didn't understand that either. It was the end of March. She must have been cold. I suppose it was the fashion to go out half-dressed these days. I thought about nudging Jenny under the table so she could share the joke, but at the last minute I didn't. Perhaps I should have brought a water bottle and filled it with gin. That sounded like a good idea. I looked at my watch, hopefully. It was only 9:30. Perhaps not. A young man made his way down the aisle towards us. He was tall, stubbly and rather handsome, and looked as though he was the outdoors type. Rugged checked shirt, Aran sweater, and sturdy-looking walking boots. He caught my gaze for the merest fraction of a nanosecond, and then his eyes swivelled away to the girl and her bosom and her water bottle. You see, that's one of the rubbish things about being older. You're still there, taking up space, needing stuff, wanting attention. But you gradually become invisible and unimportant. It's very annoying. I wanted to reach out and grab his arm as he passed. "Excuse me, young man, I can assure you I was quite cute back in 1843, I wanted to say. I had quite a lot of admirers. I haven't always been grey-haired with a slightly dodgy cholesterol count and a problem hip. I wore miniskirts, and I had a Bieber flapper dress. I wore caftans as a fashion statement, not to cover up my flab. In my head, I was 36 at the most. In my head, I still had a figure that made builders whistle. Not that they were allowed to do that anymore, obviously. 5.5 hours later, Jenny had got halfway through her book, which I think was called something like The Worst Day in the History of the Universe. Judging by her expression, there weren't many laughs. She'd also finished knitting one sleeve, which lay curled on the table between us like a huge dead caterpillar, and eaten her packed lunch, which looked like a dull affair of colourless things and cardboard bread. I'd eaten an unsatisfactory panini, flavour unknown, from the ferry cafe, and had walked around the boat, and then a snooze. And then we reached Roscoff. It was much bigger than I remembered, but with the same sort of uninteresting warehouses you'd expect to see at any ferry port. Far below us, the engine shuddered as the captain put the brakes on, or whatever it was he was doing. Jenny rolled up her knitting, put her bookmark in her book and closed it with a decisive thump. "We'd better be going," she said. "We don't want to hold people up." "What people?" She didn't answer. Obediently, I picked up my case and followed her. We joined the queue of people heading slowly down the echoing iron stairwells to the car decks below us. Jenny's car, a massive, fairly new red Chelsea tractor thing, was near the front of the boat, presumably because she had been one of the first to arrive at the quayside that morning, and the ramp was already being lowered, allowing us our first glimpse of Roscoff and France. It was very exciting. People many rows behind us who hadn't a hope of moving any time soon were already starting up their engines. Perhaps they were the people we didn't want to hold up. Some were panicking and shouting at their children things like, "Come on! No, Orlando, I've got Mr. Teddy. Oh, for heaven's sake, Indigo, hurry up or Daddy will go without you." That was a waste of their nagging reserves. The ferry hadn't even stopped yet. And any child who had a basic knowledge of parenting fails, and they all seemed to, knew that going without you simply wouldn't happen. I didn't think children were allowed out of the front door without an armed guard where I lived. But hey-ho, we had arrived safely, and perhaps now was the opportunity to start some sisterly bonding. The miles of paperwork, angry-looking customs officials, and terrifying but strangely attractive policemen with guns would soon all be behind us. When we first planned this journey over the course of countless emails, Jenny had offered to drive. She told me she did all their holiday driving because Paul didn't approve of driving on the wrong side of the road, as though the French had done this out of a need to personally antagonise him. And I certainly wasn't going to argue about it. Jenny had passed her driving test first go. I had taken 4 attempts and still wasn't very good at parallel parking. When we were younger, Jenny used to drive us everywhere in her battered Mini. Glastonbury, the Isle of Wight, shopping trips and nights out. And she could change a tyre too, and had a far better sense of direction than anyone I knew. I owned a fairly basic car without the glories of air conditioning and sat-nav that Jenny's car had, and the MOT was about to expire. To start off, the drive was really scary, like being next to Lewis Hamilton at the beginning of a Formula One race when everyone roars away from the starting grid. I would have shut my eyes, but as Jenny hadn't owned the car long enough to know how to set the sat-nav, and I was supposed to be navigating, it wouldn't have been a particularly helpful thing to do. She hunched over the steering wheel, her knuckles white. It was like a mouse driving a fire engine. Gradually, the traffic thinned out, and we plunged west, deep into the Brittany countryside, while other suicidal cars filled with tight-faced families, also unfamiliar with driving on the wrong side of the road, veered off towards Morlaix, leaving us on roads that were smaller and more winding as the journey progressed. Neither of us spoke much, except when Jenny snapped out questions. "Do you mean this roundabout? Left? You mean left here or the next one? For heaven's sake, you're the one with the map. Which way?" Occasionally, I sneaked to look at my sister. After a while, she had relaxed, and she seemed to be coping okay under the circumstances. I was filled with admiration for her. Even the unfamiliar road signs and roundabouts didn't seem to faze her. I would have been whimpering behind the wheel 5 minutes after we left the ferry port. Jenny now had her prescription Polaroids perched accurately on her nose against the sun as we sped west through cute French villages where everyone seemed to be carrying baguettes. I wished, not for the first time, that I'd remembered my sunglasses. Perhaps there would be a colourful little shop in a nearby village with a smiling owner with a beret who would be charmed by my ability to speak schoolgirl French, where I could buy some once we were settled. Every time I wore them, I would remember a happy shopping expedition with my sister. "Oh, these sunglasses? I bought these in France. My sister and I had such a lovely holiday." Meanwhile, I was still busy trying to make sense of the road map that at no point appeared helpful or accurate, and was covered in strange little icons I didn't understand. "We will need to turn off soon," Jenny said confidently. "I remember this village. I don't think it's far now." "You're doing great," I said, peering at the map again, hoping for some clue as to where we were. Thank heavens one of us knew where we were going. By the time we had negotiated a couple of roundabouts and been through a few towns, I didn't have a clue, map or not. Chapter 2. About an hour later we reached our destination. In front of us, bathed in early evening sunset, was the sign for the house, Jolis arbres, pretty trees. Underneath that was a hand-painted wooden board, Galerie d'art, which had fallen over into the bushes. Behind the closed ironwork gates, I remembered, we could see a weed-riddled track leading between scrubby-looking and not particularly pretty trees towards the house. There was a tantalising glimpse of the stone walls and a roof with lichen-peppered tiles. It looked promising. I got out of the car to push the gates open. The warmth of the day was past now, and there was a chilly breeze. The air was fresher here, though scented with something that was almost herbal. Whatever that was, I would have to find out. Anyway, it was gorgeous, and much better than the smell I was used to at home in Bristol, which was dusty and urban, with a top note of diesel and occasionally kebab. I got back into the passenger seat. "Put your seatbelt on," Jenny said. "It's not far," I replied. "You're making the car beep," she said. "It's annoying." I fastened my seatbelt. Jenny drove through and up to the house. Yes, there were new windows and a new front door. I remembered it now. The porch was tiled and blocked with piles of leaves and small twigs. The windows were framed by wooden shutters, the colour of which had probably been blue, now faded to grey, the paint peeling after years under the French sun. There were ropes of a climbing plant up the front of the house, it looked like wisteria, and some empty terracotta pots on either side of the door. There was an unmistakable air of neglect and slight disrepair. Well, the house had been empty for the best part of a year since Sheila had died. That's how long it had taken to sort out the paperwork, and our solicitor's understanding of French legalese had been stretched to the maximum. I looked at Jenny, wanting her to be pleased, hoping she was happy. From her expression, I couldn't tell. Never mind. We were here now, and Jenny had the front door keys in her hand. I was twitching with excitement and a pressing need for the loo, which at my age should never be ignored. Hurry up, I can't wait to see inside. Do you think she put the shower in? Yes, she did, Jenny said, wrestling with the unfamiliar lock. At last, there was a grinding squeak, and the door opened. I think I could speak for both of us. It wasn't quite what we'd been expecting. The hallway was darker than I remembered and smelled of dust. Piles of leaves had blown in under the door. To one side was the large sitting room with its low-beamed ceiling, and 3 of the ugliest sofas I'd ever seen. To the other was the gloomy kitchen, still furnished with the same wooden cabinets, and a huge stone sink like a horse trough. And then there was the rather poky dining room that Sheila had never used whenever I'd stayed with her. Further still was the bedroom I had slept in the last time, with the same formidable iron bedstead and a massive oak wardrobe that could have led to Narnia. There was a second similar bedroom behind the first, and then 2 bathrooms. Each one was reasonably clean, but frankly hideous, fully tiled in brown and orange, with dark brown paintwork and grimy, frosted windows. There was the biggest spider France had to offer, dead in one shower tray. I heard footsteps tapping upstairs. Evidently Jenny was also exploring. It might have been dark and a bit neglected now, but through the kitchen window was still the most magnificent view of the countryside, which flared away below us, yellow with gorse bushes, towards the sea in the distance. It really was wonderful. I could see a couple of yachts, their sails bellying in the breeze, and what must have been a cruise ship moving slowly across the horizon like a giant white pram. I think I'd anticipated it would have changed more, into something more exciting, I suppose. I remembered sitting with Sheila under a stone pergola near the swimming pool. She'd set the table for tea with an embroidered cloth and flowered china. My first husband, Frank, had topped up his cup from a hip flask when he thought I wasn't looking. I'd hoped it would be sunlight-filled and jolly, which was daft. At my age, I should have been used to things not living up to expectations. And yet at the same time, there was such a nice feel to the place, something comfortable and friendly. They say you can tell if you want to buy a house within seconds, and it had nothing to do with new carpets or accent wall colours. It hasn't changed that much, has it? Not really, Jenny said as she rejoined me in the sitting room some minutes later. What were you expecting? Versailles? No, of course not. It's got heaps of potential, though, hasn't it? I like it. What's it like upstairs? Have there been any changes? I asked encouragingly. Not really, apart from the shower. It's all a bit dull, like this, Jenny said, flicking a hand over the back of the ugliest sofa. If one could be singled out. I'll take the upstairs bedroom, unless you have any strenuous objections. There was the old Jenny, taking the lead again, actually making a decision. I was delighted to see it. No, of course not, whatever you want. We stood in silence for a moment, my excitement evaporating. We were here. The journey was over. Now we had to get to grips with things. I'm going to find the pool. At least there is that to look forward to, I said. I've bought a new cosy especially. I went, well, I think we should bring the cases in first and get settled, Jenny said, turning briskly through the front door. I followed her to where the car was sitting, covered in dust from the gravel drive. Jenny tutted at the sight of it. Paul would be livid if he could see that. Good job he's not here then, I said. Jenny laughed a bit uneasily. Whatever the house was like, we both agreed its position was fabulous. We stood together for a moment, admiring the sweeping view down across the green landscape towards the shining sea in the distance. I sighed happily. Just gorgeous, isn't it? Sheila was happy here, wasn't she? It has a nice vibe. Yes, she was. She said the light here was good for her artwork and the wine was cheap. Come and get your case out of the boot. How could the house be good for art when it was so dark, I wondered. I thought artists lived in north-facing attics with skylights and white walls. But didn't she work outdoors most of the time? Oh, yes, I remembered her now, sitting in the garden with her easel in front of her, a paint-splattered overall covering her clothes. The memory made me smile. Suddenly, there was a loud hooting cry behind us, and startled we turned. A stringy-looking man was coming up the driveway on a scruffy donkey. He waved with excitement and hooted some more as he came closer, and the donkey gave us a resigned look. "Bienvenue," he shouted. "Welcome." He clambered off the poor animal and came forward, whipping his cloth cap off his head, nodding and welcoming us a bit more. "Bienvenue, mesdames, charmante dame, bienvenue." Jenny edged behind me. "What does he want?" she hissed. "He's just being friendly. He's welcoming us. He thinks we're charming." I stepped forward and took the newcomer's outstretched hand, which was tanned and calloused. He shook each of our hands in turn, clutching his cap to his chest with emotion. "Bienvenue. Quelle belle journée. What a lovely day. Si heureuse de vous voir." "What?" Jenny muttered, surreptitiously wiping her hand down her leg. "He's pleased to see us," I said. Jenny rose to the challenge. "Bonjour." The newcomer smiled, his teeth as yellow as his donkey's. He prodded himself enthusiastically in the chest. "I am Bertrand. Friend, Sheila. Welcome, lovely ladies." "Thank you," Jenny said. Bertrand dug into a capacious trouser pocket and pulled out a bunch of keys, which he shook at us. "I have keys. Keys to this house. Nice keys. Clay." "God, Kitty, take them off him quick," Jenny said, "before he just lets himself and his donkey in." I did so, shoving them into my pocket. "Merci, monsieur." "D'accord. Hurrah!" he cheered. "Everything is good." The donkey joined in with an impressive bray, and Bertrand smiled broadly, showing several more impressive teeth the donkey might have envied. "Âne. Donkey," he said, patting the animal fondly on its neck and releasing a cloud of dust. "Il s'appelle Hector." "The donkey is called Hector," I translated. "I got that part. You should have closed the gate. Make it go away," Jenny muttered. "Stop being so antisocial," I muttered back. "I thought French men were supposed to be sexy and attractive," she said, like Yves Montand or Sacha Distel. Well, perhaps he was. 30 years ago, she added rather too loudly. Stop it, I said. He may be very helpful, and he might have been a good friend to Sheila. Jenny inched away around the car. That donkey is looking at me, and I think it's just made a disgusting smell. I giggled. Jenny had never really been an animal lover when we were growing up. I remembered a family trip to a zoo when she asked to be allowed to stay in the car park and was only lured out with the promise of ice cream. He knows you don't like him. They can smell fear, you know, I said, teasing her. Merci beaucoup, Jenny said, and stalked back into the house, her shoulders twitching. Bertrand and I exchanged a look. I was trying very hard not to laugh. He held up a gnarled finger, his button eyes bright with excitement. Léo Bizet. Je lui dirai que vous êtes arrivé. I will tell him. I will tell Léo. Merci, I said, with no idea who Léo might be. Perhaps the local sex maniac or purveyor of unsightly donkeys. And demain, tomorrow, Mimi prendra les poulets, bien sûr. What? Something about chickens. I was quickly realising that schoolgirl French was one thing, actual French was quite another. Jenny was back 10 seconds later, her face panicked, her eyes desperate. Oh my God, tell me it's not true. There's no mobile signal or Wi-Fi. Bertrand nodded and pulled a mobile phone in a surprisingly sparkly cover out of his pocket, waving it sadly in the air. Not today, he said. He made a little motion, miming something with one index finger. Réinitialiser. Il doit être démarré, mais dans le village. Plenty of l'internet. In the village, dans le cybercafé. Plenty. Hector brayed unattractively in agreement and shook his head, releasing another cloud of dust and another awful smell. Cyber cafe, Jenny said faintly, flapping her hand in front of her face. Who'd have thunk it? Chapter 3. Jenny settled into the upstairs bedroom, which was large but cheerless. I chose the bigger of the two downstairs bedrooms next to the kitchen, so it was at least close to the kettle. The house was dull with disuse, but it had a lovely, friendly feel and was full of surprising things. An old linen press on the landing upstairs was filled with the sort of antique French bed linens that would have sent Kirsty What's-her-name on the TV into ecstasy. There were cupboards in the kitchen filled with tinned food with unfamiliar labels, and a walk-in pantry as big as my box room at home. On the shelves were Kilner jars full of pasta and rice, and there was a vegetable rack containing a few fossilised and unidentifiable remnants, and a large and surprisingly new fridge-freezer, which had been cleaned out, the doors left propped open. There was also a thrilling-looking and cavernous cupboard under the stairs, filled to capacity with grimy bottles of wine. The locals must have been very honest. Back home, that would have been ransacked in minutes. I still wasn't allowed to go looking for the pool because the fridge-freezer was empty. So we switched it on, got back into the car, and made a trip out to the nearest supermarché, where we stocked up with milk, beautiful-looking fruit and vegetables, eggs, and a fine selection of cheeses. There might not have been Wi-Fi, but this was looking really positive as far as I was concerned. Jenny declared herself practically a vegetarian and looked at the displays of meat with a shudder. I wonder why they have pictures of horses. Oh, that's awful. It's okay. We won't buy any. I wasn't planning to give you hamburgers de cheval anyway, I said cheerfully. Perhaps they will have some nice soya ones for you in the freezer section. Paul doesn't approve of soya. He says it uses up all the world's resources and most of it goes for animal feed. Perhaps we could just have some pasta? With this luminous sauce, I suggested, holding up a jar. Jenny frowned. Well, surely you could make something. That's full of sugar and chemicals. Ooh, look, proper baguettes. She picked one up and held it to her nose, eyes closed. Oh, that's gorgeous. And croissant. I chucked a bag of about 20 into the trolley. Oh, that will help your cholesterol, Jenny said. I don't care much. Well, I won't pick you up off the floor when you have a coronary, Jenny said. I don't suppose you will. Which reminds me, thinking about the floor, we need some cleaning things. True. We added some cleaning products into the trolley, and then I did what I always do, made some impulse purchases. A plastic tablecloth patterned with the silhouettes of ladies in lace caps and sabots, and a giant box of chocolate milkshake powder, which we both remembered from our childhood. Paul would go berserk if he could see that, Jenny murmured, stroking the side of the packet. Well, he can't, I said. Do you remember camping in the garden and we used to have that with hot milk? Mum would bring it out in a thermos. And cheese and pickle sandwiches. I haven't had a cheese and pickle sandwich for years, she said wistfully. How about a cheese and pickle baguette? Even better. Now you're talking. And we used to have a pile of Jackie magazines, and you used to read out the picture stories in a funny voice and make up new words.
Emma, are you asking me to the dance, hen? I asked in a gruff Glasgow docker's voice.
I'd love to, but I'm washing my hair, and the day after is my audition for the Royal Ballet School.
Jenny snorted with laughter and gave me a friendly shove. Then I saw a stand filled with sunglasses that were rather glittery and odd and not what I had in mind. I picked out a pair that were more than a nod to some 50s starlet, or Dame Edna Everage, depending on one's viewpoint. Oh, well, they would do for the time being. Knowing me, I'd probably sit on them or lose them. What do you think? I asked. Jenny blinked. You look like Mum. That didn't come out right. I meant like Mum, but better. You know. Well, that wasn't the response I had hoped for when I imagined buying new sunglasses with my sister, but it was a start. We were both in a reasonably good mood by the time we got home. After a bit of casual questioning, Jenny had admitted she was looking forward to some time to herself, and not having to worry about Paul's requirements, which she said with a meaningful look. Perhaps Paul, while approaching a late retirement, still had a spring in his step, so to speak. I've always rather enjoyed the company of men, and sex as well, to be honest. Surprising, really, as my mother had always led us to believe that all men were foul fiends under their veneer of pretended domesticity. Jenny and I had once discussed whether or not our father was also a foul fiend. He seemed pretty mild-mannered to us, the kindest, nicest man. Mum had pursed her mouth disapprovingly when I divorced Frank and his alcoholism. There's never been a divorce in this family, Kitty, and almost laughed when she heard about bigamist Oliver. I always had my doubts about him. Thank heavens she hadn't lived long enough to know about Steve and his treacherous trousers. I hadn't shared a bed with a man for several years, and I felt quite wistful for a moment, until I remembered the snoring and the occasional unwelcome noises that went with it. Still, there was one thing I was sure Jenny and I would both agree on. I'll get the wine. I opened the makeshift armoire à vin under the stairs. Do you think we should, Jenny said doubtfully. Sheila, do you mind if we open a bottle of wine? I called at the ceiling. I waited for a moment. There. She didn't say anything. Midweek drinking? Paul would... Well, maybe just a small glass while we make dinner. I wonder what Paul is eating. He's terribly fussy about his food. She darted me a worried look in case she had seemed disloyal, I suppose. This revelation came as no surprise to me. I remember him dissecting a chicken dinner I once made for him as though he suspected me of hiding broken glass in it. I pulled out a bottle and inspected the label. Chateau Montbrison, I said. I've never heard of that, have you? Anyway, it'll do. Jenny peered over my shoulder. 1988. Is a bit past its sell-by date, isn't it? Well, if it's gone off, we'll try another one, I said, sloshing some red into 2 glasses, and red wine is very good for your heart, which will counteract the damage I intend to do with the croissants tomorrow morning. Where did you hear that? Breakfast television? An angel came to me in a dream, I replied airily. You're still very silly, even at your age, she said, shaking her head. I am, and I intend to remain so. Cheers. We clinked glasses and exchanged a look. Don't tell Paul, Jenny said. You worry far too much about your husband. I was enjoying the warming glow from the first sip of wine. It was really nice. Well, perhaps you didn't worry enough about yours, Jenny countered. Ooh, touché, I said. I'm not going to let you get to me. Now play nicely, Jenny. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps I hadn't worried enough about the 3 men I had married. But what good would that have done in the long run? Had any of them worried about me and my happiness? I'm just saying, she said, a bit apologetic. Well, don't. I'm going to make a tomato sauce for the pasta. There's a huge basil bush by the kitchen door. I'll sling some of that in too, and we could have some garlic bread. Jenny tutted. Are you addicted to fats and carbohydrates? No wonder you've put on weight. I haven't. She looked smug. I think you'll find you have. I bet those trousers have an elasticated waist, don't they? Well, actually, they don't, so Yahboo sucks to you, I said, feeling my good mood falter. Do you know, Paul is the same weight as the day we married. How simply marvellous for you, I said, banging the saucepans about. I expect he wears the same crimpline slacks, too. Jenny looked uncomprehending. I finished my wine and refilled the glass. In the end, we constructed a rather pleasant meal. Linguine of uncertain age and a rich tomato and basil sauce, which I perked up with some of the red wine. The label seemed to suggest it was probably too good for cooking with, but there were dozens of other bottles, so a small slosh wouldn't hurt. Jenny had watched me cook with an anguished look on her face. Don't you weigh anything? I mean, how much garlic? What did you do with the tomatoes? Don't you cook at all? I asked, amazed. You used to love it. Remember when we used to cook Christmas dinner together and sneak the sherry while we were doing it? She laughed and her expression relaxed. I can still almost remember the Boxing Day hangovers we used to get too. Remember that bread sauce the year Auntie Jane came to stay? We had to practically pressure wash the saucepan afterwards. To be honest, I haven't really cooked for years. Paul saw me licking a spoon once when I was making a casserole, and after that he took over. And he doesn't like the smell of food in the house, so he prefers ready meals so that he knows exactly how much fat and sugar he's eating. So it's more the art of the microwave than MasterChef these days. Jenny wrestled for a bit with her linguine, and we tucked in. It was really rather good, though I say so myself. It made a change to be cooking for someone else, too. I loved messing about in the kitchen, but I'd been a bit toast-reliant over the last year. Sometimes it hardly seemed worth the bother just cooking for myself. Jenny wiped the last of her garlic bread around her plate thoughtfully and placed her cutlery neatly together. "That was rather good, actually. Miss Cattermole would be spinning in her grave if she could see the mess we've made. Do you remember her? Domestic science teacher. Tried to teach us how to cook at the grammar school. Sour old puss." "I do remember her. She told Mum I was unteachable and would end up an old maid because no man would want to marry a woman who couldn't make mayonnaise properly." Jenny snorted. "Well, she got that wrong, didn't she? I can't make mayonnaise either, and I've been married for 35 years. I stopped collecting up the plates and turned to look at her. "God, have you? How awful." I can hear her now, old Cattermole. "For heaven's sake, Catherine Patterson, why can't you be more like your sister?" "You're joking. The only thing I did properly was clean up afterwards. That's why she liked me. Most of my stuff was inedible. Custard you could cut with a bread knife. And what do you mean, how awful? I think I have a good marriage." "Do you?" I said doubtfully. "I think so." She didn't sound too sure all of a sudden. Perhaps it was the wine loosening her up a bit. "And of course I have Ace. That makes up for everything." "Ah, the trump card, the son and heir." "You never had children. You wouldn't understand," Jenny said pompously. This made me cross. "It wasn't for lack of trying, and I did want them. It just never happened. Steve has a new child bride. She's half his age, and Leanne is about to undergo the miracle of birth any day now." Jenny guffawed. "Miracle of birth? Don't make me laugh. Unless they have found a new way to do it, she's in for a thoroughly ghastly time." Still, I thought later as I unpacked my bags in my gloomy bedroom, I would have liked a child. A tall son to sling an arm around my shoulder and ruffle my hair when I did something daft. Or a daughter to make sense of life with and to explain to why her many boyfriends weren't good enough for her. My imaginary children were always well-behaved and clever. They wouldn't have pinched gin from the drinks cupboard as I had. My daughter would not have rolled her school skirt up at the waistband as she walked with a smirk on her face to the train station. My son would not have got drunk on cheap cider behind the youth club and shoved his friends into other people's hedges. I wondered which of my 3 ex-husbands would have made the best father. None of them, if I was honest. And would I have made a good mother? That was something I had wondered a lot over the years as the dream faded. Had I possessed the patience, the courage, to bring another human into the world and keep them safe? To guide them? Steer them away from the sort of mistakes I had made? Chapter 4. The bed was possibly the most uncomfortable one I've ever slept on, or rather tried to sleep on. The bed frame jangled like a wind chime every time I turned over, and I turned over a lot, and the mattress was stuffed with Hector's hoof trimmings as far as I could judge. Just after 5 o'clock, I finally gave up the unequal struggle and went to make tea. Outside, the dawn was breaking and the light over the sea was almost glowing. I unbolted the kitchen door and went out into the garden. The morning was cool and quiet, and the scrubby grass was flattened and damp with dew. I stood, breathing in the clean French air with my mug of tea on a rustic patio made from old flagstones, the weeds thick between them, and felt unexpectedly happy.